A mother was sentenced to the electric chair for stealing food to feed her starving daughters. Seconds before she was executed, the girls rushed into the courtroom and handed an envelope to the judge, which left him in tears. The sun had not yet risen when Helen crossed the empty community market parking lot, her footsteps echoing on the asphalt as she adjusted the faded badge on her uniform. At 32, her face already bore deep marks of worry, persistent dark circles that even the best concealer couldn't hide. Her calloused hands from restocking shelves gripped the strap of her bag where she kept dinner for her twin daughters, a half-pack of cookies and a small juice box she had managed to buy with her employee discount. Sophia and Claire, having just turned 7, slept at home under the care of neighbor Mrs. Dolores, who charged only a plate of food as payment for her hours of work. The market was still quiet when Helen began her routine, organizing the produce section shelves. Her eyes scanned the price tags, and her heart tightened as she saw the numbers rising each week. The minimum wage she earned barely covered the rent for the small apartment where she lived with the girls, let alone the utility bills and the food that 2 growing children needed. The twins never complained, but Helen noticed their sad looks when they opened the nearly empty fridge or when they had to share a single bread loaf for breakfast. "Helen, I need to speak with you." Richard's deep voice interrupted her thoughts. Tall and always dressed in his impeccable suit, he gestured from the stockroom entrance. Helen felt a chill in her stomach when she noticed Regina beside him, the market owner and town prosecutor, known for her zero-tolerance policy against any kind of offense. Regina, in her navy blue suit and high heels that echoed down the hallway, was feared by all employees. Her cold eyes ran over Helen from head to toe as an artificial smile formed on her red-painted lips. "Miss Helen," Regina began, her voice laden with false cordiality, "it has come to my attention that you have been requesting many salary advances. This is not a practice we encourage. Our employees should learn to live within their means." The words hit Helen like blows, each syllable charged with barely concealed contempt. Richard remained silent, avoiding looking directly at his longest-serving employee. Helen felt the tears welling up, but held them back. She thought of Sophia and Claire, of the nights she heard them crying from hunger while pretending to sleep so as not to worry her. She thought of the drawings they made at school, always depicting a bountiful dining table, as if through art they could manifest their greatest desire. "Mrs. Regina, please," her voice trembled. "I have 2 young daughters to feed. The salary barely covers our basic needs. If you could give me a chance." Regina raised her hand, interrupting Helen's plea. "We're not here to solve personal problems. If you can't support yourself on what we pay, I suggest you find another job. And I'll take this opportunity to inform you that, effective today, we are suspending all employee benefits, including purchase discounts." Her smile widened as she saw the despair in Helen's eyes. "Zero tolerance also applies to employees who abuse privileges. Richard, escort her to her work area. And Helen, consider this a final warning." When Regina left, the sound of her heels echoing down the empty hallway, Helen remained motionless, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. In her mind, she saw the faces of Sophia and Claire, so much like her own, their brave smiles even on the toughest days. She remembered the promise she had made to herself when the girl's father abandoned them, that her daughters would never go hungry, that they would have a dignified life. Now, that promise seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of confused emotions. Helen watched customers filling their shopping carts, whole families choosing products she could only dream of offering her daughters. When the clock finally marked the end of her shift, she gathered her belongings in the small locker room, her hands trembling as she thought of having to explain to the girls why dinner would be even scarcer that night. The market clock showed nearly midnight when Helen returned through the back, using the key all employees had for the overnight cleaning crew. Her hesitant footsteps echoed down the dark hallway as she made her way to the discard area, where expired products were separated for destruction. Her heart was pounding so hard, it seemed like it would leap out of her chest, her hands shaking as she opened the stockroom door. The image of Sophia and Claire sharing the last piece of bread at dinner hammered in her mind, along with the words they had tried to disguise their hunger. "It's okay, Mom. We're not that hungry anyway." Under the faint moonlight coming through the hopper window, Helen rummaged through the discard boxes. She found packages of pasta and cookies that had expired that day, cans of tomato sauce and beans just one day past their due date. Her trembling hands placed the items in a paper bag as silent tears streamed down her face. With each product she took, she felt as if a piece of her dignity was being torn away, but the voice of necessity screamed louder than her pride. "Forgive me, Mum," she whispered into the void, thinking of her girls. Well, what do we have here?" Richard's voice cut through the silence like a razor blade. The main warehouse light suddenly flicked on, revealing not only the manager but also Regina, smiling with cruel satisfaction. Helen dropped the bag, goods rolling across the floor as her world crumbled. "I knew you'd try something like this," Regina declared, her phone already in hand. "The police are on their way. Richard, show her the cameras." The manager pointed to the corner of the ceiling, where a small camera blinked its red light. "We installed it yesterday," he explained with false regret in his voice. "Regina suspected someone was stealing expired products." Helen felt her legs weaken, leaning against the cold wall as the reality of the situation hit her like a punch in the stomach. Outside, sirens began to wail, approaching the market rapidly. "Please," Helen begged, her voice choked with despair. "My daughters, they have no one else but me." Regina adjusted her impeccable blazer, her smile widening as she heard the sirens. "You should have thought of them before becoming a criminal. Zero tolerance, remember. Richard, escort the officers here." The manager left quickly, leaving Helen alone with Regina, who watched her like a predator before prey. 2 police officers entered the warehouse, followed by Richard, who gestured dramatically, pointing to the products scattered on the floor. "She broke into the market to steal," he declared with rehearsed indignation. "We have it all recorded." Helen felt the cold metal of the handcuffs on her wrists as she was led out of the market. The night sky seemed to mock her with its bright stars, silent witnesses to her humiliation. On the sidewalk in front of the market, a small group of neighbors had already formed, attracted by the vehicle's lights. Among them, Helen recognized Mrs. Dolores, who held Sophia and Claire by the hand. The girls, still in their pajamas, looked at the scene in horror. "Mommy!" Their desperate screams tore through the night. Sophia tried to run towards her, but was restrained. Claire cried profusely, calling out to her non-stop. "Please let me say goodbye to my daughters," Helen pleaded with the officers. But Regina promptly interfered. "None of that. Take her away." The girls continued screaming, their calls mingling with the sound of sirens as Helen was placed in the police car. Through the glass, she saw their devastated faces for the last time, their little hands outstretched towards her, begging for an embrace that would never come. The neighbors watched the scene in silence, some looking away, others whispering among themselves, but no one dared to intervene. The courtroom was silent when Regina stood up, her heels echoing on the marble floor as she approached the jury. In her hands, she held a red folder filled with carefully manipulated documents over the past few weeks. Helen, sitting on the defendant's bench in her orange prison uniform, seemed to have aged years in just a few days. Her eyes, red from crying so much, constantly sought the faces of Sophia and Claire. Sitting in the front row beside the social worker, their little hands intertwined in search of mutual comfort. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Regina began, her voice laden with false indignation, "the woman before you is not just a common thief. She is a repeat offender who abused her employer's trust, repeatedly breaking into private property to steal merchandise." She paused dramatically, displaying altered photographs that allegedly showed Helen stealing products on different dates. Security cameras don't lie. What we see here is a systematic pattern of crimes that lasted for months, causing incalculable losses not only to the establishment, but to the very society that so values order and justice. The public defender assigned to Helen barely had time to present her defense. When he mentioned the desperate situation of a single mother trying to feed her daughters, Regina interrupted him with a new series of evidence. She presented falsified records of previous thefts, purchased testimonies from market employees, and even a fake criminal record suggesting other offenses. "A mother who truly loves her children," she declared with venom in her voice, "would not choose the path of crime. She would not turn her daughters into orphans by her own choice." The judge, a man with a severe expression who had already been seen dining with Regina at expensive restaurants, did not even look at Helen as he proclaimed the sentence. In light of the irrefutable evidence presented by the prosecution, and considering the heinous and recidivist nature of the crimes committed, this court sentences the defendant to the death penalty. The execution will be carried out in 30 days as the law dictates. The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the room like a gunshot, sealing Helen's fate. "No! Mommy!" The twins' desperate screams cut through the air as the officers handcuffed Helen to take her back to prison. "My daughters!" She tried to reach them, but was brutally restrained. Sophia and Claire ran towards her, but were intercepted by the social worker, a woman with an impassive face holding a folder with the Santa Severina Orphanage logo. "Come, girls." Her voice was as cold as ice. "This will now be your new home." Regina watched the scene with a satisfied smile, her lips curving slightly as she organized her evidence in the red folder with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the law for her own benefit. Her fingers slid over the polished leather surface of the folder, as if inside it was not only Helen's fate, but the proof of her own unquestionable power. The courtroom was silent, with only a few discreet murmurs echoing through the room. The sound of Regina's heels resonated on the shiny marble as she approached Helen, who was still trying to process what had happened. As she passed by her, she leaned slightly and whispered, "Now they will learn to live without a mother." Helen felt her blood run cold, her legs weakened, and if it weren't for the guards holding her, she might have fallen right there. Her heart pounded erratically, a drum of panic that reverberated in her ears. The air seemed thin, as if someone were sucking all the oxygen around her. "No!" Her voice erupted in a scream that tore through the courtroom. She struggled, trying to break free from the officer's firm hands, but it was useless. "My daughters! You can't do this!" Sophia and Claire, still sitting on the front row bench, shuddered upon hearing their mother. Their little bodies reacted instinctively, and the two stood up at the same time, trying to run to her. But strong hands stopped them. "Mommy!" The girl's screams echoed through the courtroom like a desperate plea. Helen's eyes filled with tears as she watched her daughters struggling against the social worker, their tiny hands trying to reach something that was becoming increasingly distant. Helen felt her world crumble as she was dragged out of the courtroom, her feet being forced to move against her will. Each step took her further away from what she loved most. Each meter traveled made the reality more unbearable. The screams of her daughters faded into the distance, muffled by the murmurs and whispers of those present. The last glimpse she had was of Sophia and Claire being pushed into an official car, their small hands pressed against the glass. Their faces were marked by tears of despair, their trembling lips whispering something inaudible as the car's engine started. Helen tried to register every detail, the shape of their eyes, the curls disheveled by crying, the distorted reflection of the city lights on the rain-soaked windows. She opened her mouth, tried to scream again, but no sound came out. Only a crushing emptiness took hold of her. As she watched the vehicle on the street, a chilling certainty pierced her chest. Her daughters were being taken to a place where maternal love would be replaced by rigid rules and severe punishments. A place where the only thing they could do was survive. The corridors of the Santa Severina Orphanage were as cold as the looks Sophia and Claire received every morning. The grey walls, peeled by time, seemed to suck all joy from the environment, leaving only the echo of the nuns' hurried footsteps and the occasional muffled sob of a child. The twins, still wearing the same clothes from the day of the trial, huddled on their iron beds at night, whispering words of comfort to each other as their stomachs growled with hunger. The orphanage's director, Sister Constance, had declared that the daughters of criminals needed to learn humility through regular fasting. During meals in the communal cafeteria, the other children shied away from the twins as if they carried some contagious disease. "Look at the thief's daughters," they whispered, amid malicious laughter. "Be careful, they might steal your food too." Sophia, the eldest by only 3 minutes, tried to protect Claire by positioning herself between her and the aggressors, but the cruel words always found a way to hurt them. The already meager portions of thin gruel were often accidentally spilled by a passing peer, while the nuns pretended not to see the bullying happening right under their noses. "Sophia," Claire whispered one night after all the lights were turned off, "do you think Mom is as hungry as we are?" Her trembling voice revealed not only the physical pain of hunger, but mainly the emotional anguish that gnawed at her little heart. Sophia pulled her sister closer, sharing the thin blanket that barely protected them from the cold seeping through the poorly sealed windows. "Mom is strong," she replied, swallowing her own tears. "She always says, love keeps us strong too." The two hugged each other tighter, trying to find in each other's warmth the comfort the world had so cruelly denied them. Classes at the orphanage were difficult for Sophia and Claire. The teacher always made comments that made them uncomfortable. "We need to teach the right values to prevent past mistakes from repeating themselves," she would say, casting pointed looks at the twins. The atmosphere grew even heavier with the whispers of the other children. The girls kept their eyes fixed on their scribbled desks, their small hands intertwined under the table, silently transferring strength to one another. During recess, Sophia and Claire hid behind the old tree in the schoolyard, the only place where they could cry without being seen. There they shared memories of life with their mother, recalling the tight hugs, the bedtime stories, even the difficult moments when they shared a single loaf of bread with smiles on their faces. "Promise, we'll never separate," Claire asked every day, her eyes reflecting the same fear that haunted her sister. "I promise," Sophia replied, sealing the vow with a tight embrace. "We're all we have left of each other." That night, lying in their narrow beds, the twins created a secret ritual. When everyone was asleep, they joined their hands in the space between the beds and whispered an improvised prayer. "Mom, we're holding on, just like you always taught us. One day we'll be together again." It was in those moments that their silent tears mingled, falling on the cold dormitory floor as their childish hearts bore a weight no child should ever have to bear. Regina admired her reflection in the mirrored window of her office at the courthouse, savoring the headlines of the newspapers scattered across her mahogany desk. "Hardline prosecutor secures historic conviction. Zero tolerance, an example of justice against crime. Regina Scott, the law's guardian the city needed." Her lips curved into a satisfied smile as she watched her own interview being replayed on the local news. On screen, her impeccable image lectured about morality, justice, and the need for severe punishments to maintain social order, using Helen's case as the perfect example of her crusade against crime. Richard entered the office carrying a black folder, his usually confident face now marked by concern. "Regina, we need to talk about the market records," he whispered, closing the door behind him. "Employees are starting to ask questions about the fate of expired food. Some remember we used to donate it to charities." The prosecutor abandoned her reflection and turned to him, her heels echoing on the marble floor as she approached with calculated steps. "Dear Richard," her voice dripped sweet poison, "I thought you had already taken care of that little detail. After all, it was you who suggested we could profit more by repackaging expired products." The market manager wiped his sweaty brow, feeling the weight of Regina's predatory gaze. "I've deleted most of the digital files, but there are still physical documents in the warehouse. Donation records, control spreadsheets, even some invoices that could raise suspicions." Regina leaned over his desk, her fingers drumming on the polished wood as the gears of her mind worked. "The Helen case gave us more than just publicity, Richard. Now I have enough influence to silence any investigation. But we can't leave loose ends." She opened a drawer and took out a thick envelope, sliding it across the desk. "Here's your share of last month's profits. Use part of it to ensure those documents disappear. And Richard," her voice took on an icy tone, "if anyone else asks inconvenient questions, remind them of what happened to our dear Helen." The news on television continued exalting the relentless prosecutor who was cleaning up the city's streets. Regina poured herself a glass of expensive wine, toasting her reflection as she savored not only the drink, but mainly the power that grew with each headline, each interview, each public display of her supposed moral integrity. "To justice," she murmured to herself ironically, watching Richard rush out to follow her orders, "and to the fools who believe in it." Claire dragged herself through the orphanage's corridors, serving her punishment for the day, scrubbing the floor with a brush too small for the task. Sister Constance had decided that this would be the appropriate punishment after the girl dared to ask for another serving of porridge at breakfast. Her hands were already red from the repetitive effort, but she kept scrubbing, knowing that any sign of laziness would result in more hours of punishment. The hallway leading to the principal's office was the last on her list of chores, and Claire looked dismayed at the persistent stains on the worn floor. That's when her brush bumped into something partially hidden under the large trash can. Looking around to make sure she was alone, Claire carefully pulled the object out. It was a torn brown envelope with some crumpled sheets still inside it. Her eyes widened when she recognized the logo of the market, where her mother worked, printed in the top corner. With trembling hands, she slid the papers out, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of the printed words and numbers. Even with her limited understanding, some phrases jumped out at her. Repackaging of products, alteration of expiration dates, unrecorded additional profit. The sound of approaching footsteps made Claire hastily stuff the envelope and documents into her tattered apron. Sister Marcia walked past her with her usual look of disdain, but this time Claire barely noticed. Her mind was focused on the treasure she had just found. As soon as she finished her punishment, she ran to find Sophia in their usual hiding spot behind the old courtyard tree. "Sophia," she whispered breathlessly, "look what I found." The twins pored over the crumpled papers, trying to decipher their meaning with the limited reading ability they possessed. "This came from Mom's market," Sophia murmured, her fingers tracing the familiar logo. "But why is it talking about changing dates? Mom always said stale food made you sick." Her brows furrowed as an idea began forming in her young mind. Claire squeezed her sister's hand, feeling the same agitation. "Sophia," her voice was just a whisper. "What if Mom wasn't guilty? What if she found out something wrong at the market?" They looked at each other, a spark of hope igniting in their eyes for the first time since arriving at the orphanage. Sophia clutched the documents tightly, as if they were a piece of her mother she had found, a tenuous thread connecting her to the woman who had been torn from them. Her small fingers gripped the crumpled sheets, as if afraid they would disappear if she relaxed for an instant. The cold breeze drifting in through the broken dormitory window made the paper tremble slightly, but Sophia didn't let go. She couldn't. This was more than just scribbled numbers and words. It was a trace of a truth no one wanted to hear. "The prosecutor Regina," she spoke slowly, her brows furrowed as she tried to piece together all the loose scraps in her mind. She knew that name. All the children at the orphanage knew it. Regina was the woman behind it all, the one everyone feared, the one the nuns mentioned in hushed tones when they thought the children weren't listening. She took a deep breath, tension building in her chest. She owns the market. And what if she was doing something wrong and Mom found out? The idea was frightening, but it made sense. Why else would someone like Regina, such a powerful woman, bother to destroy the life of a humble employee? Why fabricate so much evidence against a mother who only wanted to feed her daughters? The answers were there, right in front of them, and even without fully understanding everything, Sophia knew the truth was much darker than they had imagined. Claire watched her sister, eyes wide, absorbing every word. The night chill made their small bodies shiver, but she knew it wasn't just the icy wind seeping through the cracks in the wall. It was fear. The fear of being right. The fear that their lives were even more tangled in a dangerous web than they had imagined. "If this is true," Claire swallowed hard, her voice hesitant, "it means Mom never stood a chance." Sophia nodded slowly, feeling the knot in her throat tighten. Her heart thudded heavily against her ribs, as if trying to warn her of the danger they were about to face. The twins hugged each other, trembling not from the cold this time, but from a mixture of fear and hope. Their hearts beat in the same rhythm, an echo of the unbreakable bond they had shared since their mother's womb. They had no one else in the world but each other. "We need to find out the truth," Sophia whispered into her sister's hair, squeezing her eyes shut tightly. Her voice shook, but there was a firmness to her words, a determination that not even the raging storm outside could extinguish. "We need to prove our mother is innocent." Claire tightened her arms around her sister, nodding against her shoulder. "But how?" Her voice was a thread of despair and doubt. Sophia took a deep breath, opening her eyes and looking again at the documents in her hands. The fear was still there, but something inside her, something greater, burned intensely. "We'll find someone who believes in us," she replied with conviction. "Someone who can help us." And then, at that moment, they knew they could no longer wait. The truth needed to be told, and they would do whatever was necessary to save their mother. Michael watched the cracked screen of his laptop with tired eyes, the news about Regina Scott dominating all the news portals. His small apartment, a studio on the top floor of a dilapidated building, was immersed in the twilight of late afternoon. Piles of old newspapers accumulated in the corners, yellowed headlines documenting his own fall from grace 3 years ago, when he tried to expose the obscure dealings of the now celebrated prosecutor. The peeling walls displayed clippings of his former investigative reports, trophies of a past that seemed increasingly distant, like faded photographs of a life that no longer belonged to him. The cheap whiskey bottle by his side was almost empty, a constant companion since his name was dragged through the mud in the courts. Regina had been meticulous in her revenge, fabricating evidence that he had invented sources, manipulated documents, all to tarnish her reputation. The defamation lawsuit destroyed not only his career, but his credibility, his livelihood, his dignity. Now at 42 years old, Michael survived by writing advertising copy under a pseudonym, his investigative talent buried under layers of bitterness and disbelief in the justice he once swore to defend. "The guardian of the law," he muttered with scorn, reading the latest headline that extolled Regina for her exemplary conviction of a single mother. His fingers unconsciously traced the scar on his temple, a reminder of the accident he suffered days after publishing his first article on the irregularities in her market. The alleged assailant was never found, but the message had been crystal clear. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of defeat pressing against his chest. On the wall in front of him, a web of evidence connected by red threads documented 3 years of obsessive investigation. Suspicious invoices, records of donations that disappeared, employees who suddenly left town. The phone rang, interrupting his somber thoughts. It was his editor from his glory days, Fernando, one of the few who still kept in touch. "Did you see the news?" His old friend's voice sounded worried. "She's more powerful than ever, Michael. Maybe it's time to let the past go." Michael laughed humorlessly, a harsh sound that seemed to scratch his throat. "You don't understand, Fernando. Every person she destroys, every life she ruins. It's like I'm an accomplice for failing to expose her." His eyes scanned the wall of evidence, lingering on a recent photo of Regina beside the judge who presided over his case. "She built an empire based on lies, and I'm the only one who knows the truth. But who would believe a disgraced journalist?" The silence on the other end of the line was broken by the sound of papers rustling. "Michael," Fernando hesitated, "there's something you need to know about this last case. The woman she convicted. They say her daughters may have found something at the orphanage. Something important." Michael straightened in his chair, feeling a spark of the old journalistic instinct igniting in his chest. For the first time in 3 years, a genuine smile began to form on his lips. "Tell me everything," he said, reaching for his old notebook. The cafe near the courthouse was bustling with the typical lunchtime crowd, lawyers and public servants vying for the few available tables. Michael occupied a discreet corner, his fingers drumming nervously on the mug of black coffee as he waited. Marina, a former employee of Regina's market, had agreed to meet him after much insistence from Fernando. Through the steamy window, he observed the imposing facade of the courthouse, where Regina was probably destroying someone else's life at that very moment. A middle-aged woman in a janitor's uniform hurried into the cafe, her restless eyes scanning the room until she found Michael. Marina sat down quickly, clutching her purse tightly to her chest as if carrying a precious treasure. "I don't have much time," she whispered, leaning across the table. "My shift at the hospital starts in 20 minutes, and if I lose another job—" Her voice trembled, revealing the fear Regina still instilled in her former employees. Michael noticed the deep circles under her eyes, the calloused hands that wouldn't stop shaking as she held the coffee mug he had ordered for her. "Helen was a good person," Marina continued, her voice low but charged with emotion. "We worked together in restocking. She started asking questions about the products that went missing from the warehouse, about the expiration dates that didn't match up. Regina and Richard, they repackaged everything, sold spoiled goods to people who couldn't afford better." Tears began to form in her eyes. "But the worst were the girls. You should have seen how Helen cared for them, how she saved every penny. And now those poor children are in that horrible orphanage, and everyone knows how Sister Constance treats the kids there." Michael leaned forward, his journalistic instincts awakening. "Fernando mentioned the girls may have found something. What exactly? Marina looked nervously over her shoulder before answering. My niece works as a cleaner at the orphanage. She told me she saw the twins hiding some papers. Said they looked like documents from the market, the ones Regina had Richard destroy last week. If they're the original records. She left the sentence hanging, her face pale with fear. I need to talk to those girls, Michael declared, his brain already formulating a plan. Marina gripped his arm with surprising strength. Be careful. Regina has eyes everywhere. And those girls. They've suffered enough. If anything happens to them. Michael covered Marina's trembling hand with his own, a silent promise. I'll protect them. Maybe they're our only chance to get justice, not just for Helen, but for everyone Regina has destroyed. Marina rose abruptly, smoothing her wrinkled uniform. The orphanage allows visits on Wednesdays from 2 to 4. Say you're doing a story on social assistance. And Michael. She hesitated before leaving. Don't let Regina find out. You more than anyone know what she's capable of. Watching Marina disappear into the crowd, Michael was already planning his next move. The orphanage was only 3 blocks away, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt he was close to finally unmasking Regina once and for all. Michael adjusted the fake badge on his frayed coat as he followed Sister Constance down the gloomy hallways of the orphanage. The headmistress walked ahead of him with heavy steps, explaining the institution's rules with a morbid pride in her voice. Our discipline is strict, Mr. Turner. These children need to learn structure and order from an early age. Her sour tone when mentioning the children made Michael's stomach churn, but he maintained his professional expression, pretending to take notes for his supposed report on social assistance. The visitors' room was an austere environment, with peeling walls and some plastic chairs arranged in disarray. Through the dusty window, Michael observed 2 identical girls sitting alone in the courtyard, their uniforms too large for their thin bodies, their faces lowered as if carrying the weight of the world on their small shoulders. Sophia and Claire, Helen's daughters. Even from a distance, it was possible to perceive the special bond between them, the way they remained close, as if they were each other's only source of comfort in that desolate place. Those are the twins I told you about, Sister Constance commented with disdain. Daughters of the criminal who was recently in the news. Cases like these are especially challenging. They require extra attention. The cruel glint in her eyes made clear what extra attention meant. Michael felt his hands tingle with anger, but he maintained his professional demeanor. Can I talk to them? It would be interesting to have the children's perspective for the report. The principal hesitated for a moment, but the mention of free publicity for the orphanage convinced her. Sophia and Claire entered the visitors' room like little ghosts, their steps hesitant, their frightened eyes examining every corner before sitting down. Michael noted the subtle signs of neglect, the poorly cut hair, the dirt stains on their uniforms, the thin arms suggesting poor nutrition. But there was something more to them, a spark of determination that not even this place had managed to extinguish. Hello, he said softly, sitting on the floor to be at their level. My name is Michael. I'm writing a story about brave children like you. The girls exchanged a meaningful look, a silent communication that only twins seemed capable of sharing. It was as if, in a matter of seconds, they were assessing whether they could trust that man before them. The cold wind passed through the window of the small visitors' room at the orphanage, making the worn curtains sway gently. The environment smelled of cheap disinfectant, mixed with the woody odor of old furniture, creating an impersonal and cold atmosphere. The silence lingered for a moment, only broken by the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. It was Claire who spoke first, her voice just a whisper. Do you write about things that really happen? Michael nodded, feeling his heart tighten at the hesitation in the girl's eyes. He had interviewed many people throughout his career, but rarely had he seen a look so loaded with fear and hope at the same time. They were just children, but they were carrying a burden far too heavy for their small hands. Yes, he replied firmly, leaning forward slightly, trying to convey confidence. I write about the truth even when people try to hide it, especially when they try to hide it. Sophia leaned forward too, her eyes suddenly shining with a mixture of hope and fear. Her breathing became faster, as if she was about to make the most important decision of her life. She looked around to make sure they were alone, her little eyes assessing every corner of the room, making sure no one could hear them. The way her small fingers trembled slightly as she reached into her uniform pocket indicated the magnitude of the risk they were about to take. Then, with an almost solemn care, Sophia took a folded paper out of her pocket and held it tightly for a moment before extending it to Michael. "Can you help us prove that Mum isn't a thief?" Her voice came out low but laden with an unusual seriousness for a child. Michael felt the weight of those words and hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the paper. The twins watched him as if they were handing over their last hope to him. He unfolded the sheet carefully, noting that the paper was a little crumpled, as if it had been hidden and handled countless times. His eyes ran over the scribbled notes and numbers that seemed to be financial records. He immediately recognized the logo of the market, where Helen worked, at the top of the page. His heart raced. "Where did you get this from?" he asked, trying to remain calm but unable to hide the urgency in his voice. Claire bit her lip, looking at Sophia before answering. "I found it in the principal's office trash can," she whispered. It was a big envelope with more papers inside, but when I realized it could be important, I hid this one in my pocket before she came back. Michael took a deep breath, his journalistic instincts screaming that there was the missing piece to expose Regina. "You did the right thing," he said, carefully folding the paper and putting it in the inner pocket of his coat. Then he looked directly at them. "And I promise I will prove that your mother is innocent." Regina's office was silent except for the frantic sound of her fingers on the computer keyboard. The screen cast a bluish light on her tense face as she rummaged through folder after folder in the court system, a cold sensation spreading through her chest with each file she couldn't find. The original records of Helen's case, including the forged evidence and manipulated testimonies, had simply disappeared from the server. Her hands began to tremble as she realized that the backups had also been deleted, as if someone had deliberately erased all digital traces of her conspiracy. "Richard!" Her voice cut through the silence like a razor as she pressed the intercom. Seconds later, the market manager rushed into her office, beads of sweat already forming on his forehead as he noticed Regina's furious expression. "You made sure all the physical documents were destroyed?" She slowly rose from her leather chair, her heels echoing on the marble floor as she circled the desk like a predator closing in on its prey. "Because I've just discovered that someone had access to the digital files of the case. And curiously, they're the exact same documents you were supposed to have eliminated last week." Richard paled, his hands twisting nervously. I burned everything personally, Regina, but..." He hesitated, and Regina immediately realized there was more. She moved toward him with calculated steps, her expensive perfume mingled with an aura of threat. "But..." Richard swallowed hard before continuing. "Some papers may have gotten lost during the process. The wind was strong that day, and when I was at the warehouse..." Regina interrupted him with a violent slap on the table, making him jump. "You incompetent fool! Do you know how long it took me to build that case? To fabricate each evidence, to buy each witness?" She returned to her computer, quickly opening Helen's case file. "If any of these original documents are found, it all comes crashing down. Not just her case, but every other one I've built over the years." Her eyes narrowed as an idea began to form. "We need to eliminate any possibility of that evidence coming to light, and there's only one guaranteed way to do that." Regina picked up the phone, dialing the number of the judge who owed her several favors. "Dr. Morrison, Regina Scott, I need an urgent favor." "Yes, about the Helen Carter case." Richard watched in silence as Regina manipulated the system in her favor once again, her honeyed voice distilling venom as she invented reasons to expedite the execution. "I understand the normal procedures, Dr. Morrison, but think of the implications. A convicted criminal with a history of breaking and entering, having access to time and resources to potentially harm our society." "Yes, exactly. The public needs to see that our justice is efficient." She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, as she listened to the judge's response. 9 o'clock tomorrow? Perfect." Hanging up the phone, Regina turned to Richard, who was still trembling near the door. "The execution has been moved up to tomorrow. We can't risk anyone finding something that could interfere with the sentence." She began organizing papers on her desk, her face a mask of cruel efficiency. "Now I want you to go to the orphanage, find out if those brat twins have anything they shouldn't. Use any methods necessary, but be discreet. We can't have any more accidents." Richard nodded quickly, eager to leave the office, but Regina stopped him with one last command. "And, Richard, if you fail this time, I guarantee your family will find out about that money you embezzled from the church. I'm sure your wife would be fascinated to learn how you really paid for your mistress's tuition." Michael found the twins in their usual hiding spot, behind the old yard tree, where the shadows of the leaves cast dancing patterns on the packed dirt ground. He approached slowly, like someone approaching frightened little animals, and sat down on the grass at a respectful distance. Sophia and Claire watched him with a mixture of hope and distrust, their small bodies tense, ready to flee at the slightest hint of threat. The journalist took a package of cookies he had bought on the way out of his pocket, offering it as a gesture of peace. "I thought you might be hungry," he said softly, noticing the way the girl's eyes widened at the sight of the food. "Our mother always shared her snack with us," Claire murmured, accepting a cookie with trembling hands. "Even when she had little, she made it seem like a feast." Sophia nodded, tears glistening in her eyes as she bit into her own cookie. Michael felt his heart clench at the sight of how slowly the girls ate, savoring every crumb as if it were their last meal. "Your mother sounds like a very special person," he commented, keeping his voice gentle and interested. "Would you like to tell me more about her?" The twins exchanged glances, that silent communication that only twin sisters seem to share, before Sophia gathered the courage to speak. "Mom worked really hard at the market," she began, her little hands twisting in her lap. "Sometimes when she thought we were asleep, we would hear her crying because she didn't have enough money to buy food. But she always smiled in the morning, said everything would be okay." Claire picked up her sister's story as if they shared not only an appearance but also thoughts. One day, she started asking questions about the food that was going missing from the stockroom. "We overheard her talking to Aunt Marina about bad things happening there." Michael leaned forward slightly, his journalist's instincts alerting him that they were getting to something important. Sophia looked around nervously before leaning closer to Michael, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We found some papers," she revealed, her tiny hands reaching into the hidden pocket she had sewn into her uniform. Claire found them in Sister Constance's office trash. Carefully, she removed a torn brown envelope, her fingers trembling as she held it. "It has the same logo as the market where Mom worked." Michael took the envelope with a racing heart, immediately recognizing the logo he had investigated years ago. Inside the envelope, he found documents that made his blood run cold. Detailed inventory control spreadsheets clearly showed the scheme. Products nearing their expiration date were marked as discarded, but repackaged with new dates and resold. Duplicate invoices indicated diversion of food that should have been donated to charities. On one of the sheets, he even found an internal memo signed by Regina, explicitly ordering the expiration dates to be altered to maximize profits. It was the proof he had been searching for 3 years, the missing link to expose the entire criminal operation. "Do you know what these documents are?" Michael asked gently, watching the serious expressions on the girls' faces. Claire nodded, surprising him with her astuteness. "They're papers showing that Ms. Regina and Mr. Richard were doing bad things with the food. Mom found out, didn't she? That's why they had her arrested." Sophia held her sister's hand tightly, completing the reasoning. "We can't read very well yet, but we recognize the numbers. They're the same ones Mom wrote in her little notebook when she started suspecting something was wrong." Michael carefully stored the documents, his brain already processing the implications of this discovery. 2 7-year-old children, unaware, had managed to obtain the evidence that could not only save their mother, but also bring down Regina's empire of corruption. "So you are both very brave," he said sincerely, seeing how the girl's eyes shone with the praise. "And very clever too. Keeping these papers was the right thing to do." Sophia and Claire smiled for the first time since he had met them, a smile carrying all the hope of being able to hug their mother again. Michael's apartment had turned into a labyrinth of papers and documents. The records found by the twins were scattered across his workbench. Newspaper clippings and old photographs covered every available inch of wall space. The journalist was working frenetically, his fingers flying over the laptop keyboard as he cross-referenced dates, amounts, and donation records that never reached their intended destination. Each new discovery made his stomach churn with the magnitude of the criminal scheme he was unraveling. The spreadsheets revealed a frightening pattern that repeated month after month. Tons of food were recorded as expired disposal, but the numbers didn't match the entries of new goods. Michael began to do calculations, his hands shaking as he added up the values. In 3 years, Regina and Richard had diverted more than 50 tons of food, repackaging expired products and selling them as fresh, while pocketing the money from donations that should have been made to orphanages and nursing homes in the region. The estimated profit from the operation easily exceeded millions. On the computer screen, an extensive list of charitable institutions showed the other side of the coin. Hundreds of vulnerable people who had missed out on receiving food because Regina decided to turn donations into personal profit. Michael thought of Helen, an honest employee who had probably discovered part of this scheme and therefore needed to be silenced. He thought of the twins going hungry in the orphanage while their mother faced an unjust conviction. The cruel irony did not escape him. The same children Regina had tried to destroy had ended up finding the evidence that could finally expose her crimes. His old notes took on new meaning now. Archived cases of food poisoning that were never properly investigated. Employees who quit suddenly. Health inspectors who were transferred after attempting to conduct surprise inspections at the market. Everything connected in a web of corruption and intimidation with Regina at the center, manipulating the judicial system to protect her shady businesses. Michael realized that Helen's case was not isolated. It was just the most recent in a long list of lives destroyed to keep the scheme running. The coffee cup had long since gone cold by his side as he delved deeper and deeper into the investigation. The documents found by the girls were just the tip of the iceberg, but they provided the missing link to connect all the other evidence he had collected over the years. Now, finally, he had something concrete to present. Evidence signed by Regina herself, spreadsheets detailing the scheme, records of suspicious transactions that could not be explained. Michael rose from his chair, feeling for the first time in years that old journalistic urgency running through his veins. The accumulated fatigue of the last few days seemed to evaporate, replaced by a fierce determination he had not experienced since the days when he believed journalism could change the world. The room around him, once a disorganized space of yellowed newspaper clippings and scattered notes, now seemed like a battleground about to be activated. Every red thread connecting the evidence on his mural was a path to be followed. Every name noted was a key piece waiting to be fit. He scanned the board in front of him, rereading the names and schemes detailed there. The connections between Regina and the market's diversions were glaringly obvious, but there were still gaps, holes that needed to be filled before bringing everything into public light. It wasn't enough to have the documents. He needed more. He needed to follow the money, find the employees who were silenced, discover where the repackaged products were stored. If he could track down the clandestine warehouses, he would have material evidence that no judicial maneuver of Regina's could cover up. The thought made him clench his fists. How many people had fallen ill or even died from consuming those expired foods? How many children, elderly and vulnerable families had been deceived by a corrupt system? The injustice seethed within him like lava about to erupt. Regina was not just a criminal. She was a cancer in the system, a ruthless manipulator who used the law as a weapon to eliminate anyone who threatened her position. But now, Michael had something she could never predict: the truth and the courage of two little witnesses who had nothing left to lose. The phone vibrated on his desk, bringing him back to the present. It was a message from Marina. "The twins are safe but scared. Time is running out, Michael. What do we do now?" He closed his eyes for a second, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The girls had risked everything to keep that evidence, to defy a system that wanted them silenced and invisible. He could not fail. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his coat and keys. His gaze fell on an old photograph of his first major journalistic scoop, a reminder that he had faced adversity before, but never anything of this magnitude. This battle was not just against Regina. It was against an entire system that allowed people like her to thrive with impunity. Looking at the mural of evidence he had built, Michael made his decision. Enough hesitation. Enough backing down. "This time," he murmured to himself, adjusting the collar of his coat as he walked to the door, "you won't get away, Regina. I'll expose every crime, every lie, every life you've destroyed." He paused, looking at the photo of the twins Marina had sent him. "And this time I have two little witnesses who aren't afraid of you." With that, he stepped out into the rainy night, ready to deliver the final blow. The damp basement of Jack's house, the former market security guard, smelled of mold and secrets kept. Michael followed the elderly man through piles of dusty boxes, watching as his wrinkled hands trembled slightly as he searched for something specific among his belongings. Jack had worked at the market for 2 decades before being abruptly fired a few months before Helen's arrest. Now, at 75, he lived in seclusion in his small suburban home, carrying the weight of truths he never had the courage to reveal. "I knew someone would come looking for this one day," Jack muttered, his hoarse voice evidencing years of forced silence. "When Regina ordered to update the camera system, I was the one who backed up the old files. She thought she had deleted everything, but..." His words were interrupted by a dry cough as he rummaged through a particularly dusty box. Michael waited anxiously, his heart beating faster with every moment. The old security guard finally retrieved an external hard drive, wrapped in bubble wrap, protected from the basement's moisture like a precious treasure. Jack connected the device to an outdated laptop he kept on an improvised table. "Here," he said, navigating through folders of dated files. "Night of March 12th. Richard didn't know the old system was still recording when they installed the new cameras." The screen flickered a few times before showing grainy images of the market's warehouse. Michael leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The video showed Richard in his impeccable suit, instructing employees on how to remark the expiration dates of products. "These ones have already expired," Richard's voice echoed through the laptop's broken speakers. "But Regina wants everything repackaged and put back on the shelves by tomorrow. Anyone who asks questions is out. Understood?" The camera captured the exact moment he handed new labels to the employees, who began the process of tampering with the dates under his supervision. In one corner of the warehouse, partially visible, was Helen, her face clearly registering the horror of witnessing the scene. Michael realized that must have been the moment she discovered the truth. The video continued, showing Richard making notes on a clipboard while overseeing the operation. "Separate the donations for the other warehouse," he ordered. "Regina has a buyer for that batch too." The evidence was crystal clear. Not only were they repackaging expired products, but also diverting donations meant for charities. Michael watched, feeling a mix of triumph and rage as the puzzle pieces finally fell into place. The video was the definitive proof missing to expose the entire scheme. "Why didn't you show this before?" Michael asked softly, noticing how Jack averted his gaze, ashamed. The former security guard passed a trembling hand over his wrinkled face, decades of guilt evident in his expression. "They threatened my granddaughter," he confessed in a broken voice. "Regina found out she needed an expensive transplant. She offered to pay for it all if I kept quiet and handed over the original tapes. But I couldn't destroy this copy, not after seeing what they did to that poor woman and her daughters." Michael carefully copied the file, his hands shaking slightly with the weight of the moment. That video wasn't just evidence, it was the key to Helen's freedom, to the justice so many had waited for. On the laptop, the frozen image of Richard ordering his crimes remained a silent testament to all the corruption he and Regina had spread for years. "Thank you," Michael said simply, squeezing Jack's hand. "You just saved a life." Regina strode through the courthouse hallways like a contained storm, her heels echoing menacingly on the marble floor. One of her informants had just reported that Michael, that meddling journalist she had destroyed years ago, was asking questions again. Worse still, he had been seen talking to Jack, the former security guard at the market. Her hands gripped the file of documents so tightly that her knuckles were white, while her mind quickly calculated all the potential threats she needed to eliminate. Judge Morrison awaited her in his chambers, his expression concerned at the prosecutor's agitated state. Regina closed the door with unnecessary force, her words coming out like venom. "We need to move up the execution. Tonight." The judge adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable with the request. "Regina, we've already moved it up once. There are procedures, protocols." She cut him off, leaning over his desk with a veiled threat in her eyes. "Procedures can be altered, Dr. Morrison. Or do I need to remind you of that little favor I did you in your son's case?" The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Regina could see the exact moment the judge's last resistance broke, his shoulders sagging in defeat as he reached for his pen. "I'll sign the order now," he muttered, avoiding her triumphant gaze. "The execution will be carried out at 2300 hours. Regina smiled, that cold smile that never reached her eyes, watching as the judge drafted the document that would seal Helen's fate. In a few hours, her last witness would be eliminated, and any evidence Michael might have found would be rendered useless. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her cell phone. It was Richard, his voice trembling with nervousness. "Regina, there's someone else investigating. Old Jack." He had a copy of the video. Her blood ran cold for a moment, but her voice remained controlled as she replied, "Take care of it, immediately. Use our contacts in the police if you need to, but I want that video destroyed before midnight." Hanging up the phone, Regina allowed herself a moment of concern. The noose was tightening, but she still had cards to play. "The document is ready." The judge's voice brought her back to the present. Regina took the execution order with a satisfied smile. In a few hours, Helen would be dead, and with her, any chance of her lies being exposed. Michael might have found some evidence, but without a living witness to corroborate, it would be just the word of a discredited journalist against a respected prosecutor. "It's over," she thought to herself, tucking the document into her briefcase. "No one can stop me now." The orphanage's courtyard was silent on that grey afternoon, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. Sophia and Claire were sitting in their usual hiding spot when they saw the social worker hurrying across the yard, her face carrying an expression that made the girls' hearts freeze. The twins instinctively moved closer together, their small hands intertwining for strength, as the woman approached with an official envelope in her hands. "Sophia, Claire," the social worker began, her voice trying to sound professional but betraying a tremor of compassion. "I need to inform you about a change in your mother's case." The girls remained silent, their identical eyes fixed on the envelope the woman held as if it were a bomb about to explode. "The execution has been brought forward. It will take place tonight at 11 p.m. The words fell like stones in the courtyard silence, and Claire let out a sharp sob that seemed to carry the entire weight of the world. Sophia hugged her sister tightly, her own silent tears wetting the faded orphanage uniform. The social worker kept speaking something about procedures and protocols, but the words seemed distant, meaningless, as if being spoken underwater. The entire world seemed to be falling apart around the twins, who clung to each other like shipwreck survivors. "But the papers," Claire whispered between sobs. "We found the papers. She's innocent." As if summoned by her words, Michael came running through the orphanage gate, his face flushed from exertion and his eyes shining with feverish urgency. Seeing the social worker, he slowed his pace, trying to regain his composure. "Miss," he introduced himself, quickly showing his press badge, "I need to speak with the girls about a story on social services." The social worker hesitated, glancing at her watch. "I'm sorry, but today is not a good time. The girls have just received difficult news and—" "Please," Sophia interrupted, her voice small but determined, "we want to talk to him." There was something in her tone that made the social worker relent, nodding briefly before stepping back a few paces, still watching the group. Michael knelt in front of the twins, his voice low and urgent. "I found the video. Proof that your mother is innocent. But Regina is trying to destroy all the evidence. She moved up the execution because she knows we're close to the truth." Claire clutched Michael's coat sleeve tightly, her small fingers gripping the fabric as if her life depended on it. Her eyes, wide and bright with unshed tears, stared at him in desperation. "Our mother is going to die tonight." Her voice trembled and a sob caught in her throat, making her words even more choked. Sophia, beside her sister, said nothing, but her gaze was fixed on Michael, as if trying to decipher if he was truly their last hope or just another adult unable to keep his promises. The fine rain that fell made the moment even heavier, droplets trailing down the twins' hair and dampening their already worn orphanage clothes. They were there, before him, like two children battling a fate they should never have had to bear. Michael looked at the twins' faces, marked by fear and determination, and made a decision that would change everyone's fate. His mind spun in 1,000 directions, evaluating every possibility, every risk. If they tried to enter through the main entrance, they would be stopped. If they waited for an official warrant, it would already be too late. He knew there was only one chance to prevent that fatal mistake. "No, she won't," he declared firmly, his voice coming out strong, unwavering. His heart was racing, but he couldn't let the girls sense his own fear. "We have to get inside the courthouse." Claire blinked rapidly, as if wanting to make sure she had heard correctly. Sophia gripped her sister's arm, trying to contain the euphoria and fear that mingled inside her. "But how?" Sophia questioned, her voice a thread of hope mixed with doubt. Prosecutor Regina said no one could enter. Michael looked at Marina, who was also there, breathless, still processing everything that was happening. She knew the twins well, knew the suffering they had endured, and now, seeing the raw courage in their eyes, something inside her solidified. "We need a distraction," Marina murmured, looking around, analyzing the environment around the courthouse. "If we go in through the front door, they'll stop us before we get close to the judge." Michael nodded, already formulating a plan. He looked at the girls again, now with a determined glint in his eyes. "Do you trust me?" Sophia and Claire exchanged glances before looking back at him. Claire was the first to answer, her voice faint but full of conviction. "We trust you." Michael squeezed their hands quickly and stood up. "Then let's go. We have little time." He looked at his watch. There were only a few minutes left before Helen's fate was sealed, and they were about to defy everything to change that. Marina arrived at the orphanage, dressed in her hospital cleaning uniform, pushing a cart loaded with cleaning supplies. Her eyes met Michael's, who was waiting discreetly near the back gate, and she gave a small affirmative nod. The plan they had hastily put together was risky, but it was their only chance. Michael watched as she introduced herself to the receptionist, explaining that she was substituting for the regular cleaner who had called in sick. The monotonous sound of the vacuum cleaner echoed through the hallways as Marina methodically cleaned each room, getting closer and closer to the dormitory where Sophia and Claire waited anxiously. The twins were sitting on their beds as Michael had instructed, pretending to read a book while their hearts raced. When Marina entered the room pushing her cart, the girls could barely contain their agitation. The former grocery store employee silently closed the door behind her, her movements calculated to avoid raising suspicion. "Quick," Marina whispered, opening a large black trash bag she had brought hidden. "You need to trust me now." Sophia and Claire exchanged apprehensive glances, but years of living with their mother had taught them to recognize genuine kindness in people's eyes. With careful movements, Marina helped the girls into the bag, positioning them so they could breathe through small, strategically placed holes. "Don't make a sound," she instructed, her voice trembling slightly. "No matter what happens." The path to the exit seemed endless. Marina pushed her cart with the same efficiency as always, although her hands shook slightly every time someone passed by her. The bag containing the twins was carefully positioned between cleaning products and other trash bags, but every step was an agony of fear and anticipation. Inside the bag, Sophia held Claire's hand tightly, both holding their breath every time the cart stopped or someone approached to talk to Marina. At the front desk, the security guard barely looked at her when Marina presented her ID to leave. "Done for today?" he asked automatically, more interested in the newspaper in his hands than the cleaning cart. "Yes," she replied with a calm she didn't feel. "I'll take the trash to the dumpster in the back." The man waved distractedly, and Marina pushed the cart out of the gate, her legs almost giving way with relief when she spotted Michael waiting at the agreed-upon spot, inside his old car parked around the corner. With swift but careful movements, Michael helped transfer the bag with the girls to the back seat of the car, covered by a dark blanket. Only when they were 3 blocks away from the orphanage did he finally stop to help Sophia and Claire out of their makeshift hiding place. The twins emerged panting, their hair disheveled and their faces flushed, but their eyes shone with determination. "We made it," Claire whispered, hugging her sister. Marina, sitting in the passenger seat, let out a sob of relief. "Now comes the hardest part," Michael declared, his eyes fixed on the dashboard clock that read 5 o'clock. "We have 6 hours to prevent an execution and expose a conspiracy." He looked in the rearview mirror, meeting the twins' identical gazes. "Are you ready?" Sophia and Claire nodded in unison, their expressions carrying a maturity far beyond their 7 years. The night was only just beginning, and the real challenge still lay ahead. Helen was sitting on the edge of her narrow cell bed, her fingers gently tracing the pages of the small diary where she had written letters to her daughters over the past few days. The paper was stained in several spots, marks of tears shed as she tried to explain to Sophia and Claire why Mommy wouldn't be coming home. The news of her execution being moved up had come as a final blow, robbing her even of the chance to properly bid farewell to her little ones. The orange prison uniform seemed to weigh a ton on her shoulders as the hours dragged inexorably toward the final moment. The grey walls of her cell seemed closer on that night, as if they were closing in around her. Helen closed her eyes, letting her mind wander to sweeter memories. The sound of her girls' laughter at breakfast, the smell of their freshly washed hair, the warmth of their tiny bodies as they snuggled together to sleep. A solitary tear escaped from beneath her lashes as she realized she would never feel her daughter's embrace again, never hear Sophia humming as she helped Claire with her homework, never have the chance to watch them grow up. "Time for dinner," announced the guard, sliding a tray through the small opening in the door. Helen barely looked at the food, her stomach churning with the impending end. Instead, she picked up her pen one last time, her hands trembling as she wrote the final words in the diary. "My beloveds," she began, her normally delicate handwriting now shaky with emotion. "Forgive Mommy for not being strong enough to protect you. Every breath I took in this life was out of love for you. In my final moments I am not afraid of death, only of the loneliness you will feel." The prison chaplain visited her briefly, offering words of comfort that sounded hollow to her ears. How could there be solace for a mother who would be torn away from her daughters forever? Helen politely declined his blessing, preferring to spend her last moments immersed in memories of her family. In her mind's eye, she saw Claire and Sophia running through the park, their laughter echoing like bells, their little hands waving at her. "Please," she whispered into the emptiness of her cell, "let someone care for them. Let someone protect them when I am gone." The sound of footsteps in the corridor brought her back to brutal reality. Only a few hours remained now. Helen stood, her legs shaky, and walked to the small barred window. The sky was dark and starless, as if even nature itself was in mourning. "Sophia, Claire," she murmured to the night, "Mommy loves you more than anything in this world." Her words were lost to the darkness as the clock ticked on relentlessly toward midnight. Michael's car wove through the congested city streets, its tires screeching with every tight turn he made trying to escape the traffic. In the back seat, Sophia and Claire clung to each other, their small bodies jolting with each abrupt break. The digital clock on the dashboard read 10:15 p.m., each glowing number a silent accusation as the minutes ticked mercilessly away. The courthouse was across town, and traffic seemed to conspire against them, turning every stoplight into a torture of precious seconds lost. A storm was unleashing over the city, large raindrops lashing the windshield, as if even the heavens wept at the urgency of the moment. Michael swore under his breath as a truck cut them off, forcing him to detour down a side street. The streetlights cast ghostly shadows through the wet glass, and the windshield wipers worked frantically to maintain any visibility. Marina, in the passenger seat, clutched the folder containing the evidence that could save Helen, her eyes fixed on the clock as it ruthlessly marked the passage of time. "Why is it taking so long?" Claire asked in a trembling voice, her small face pressed against the window, as if she could will the car to move faster. Sophia held her sister's hand tighter, both feeling the weight of the passing minutes. Michael took another sharp turn, ignoring the indignant honk of a driver he nearly clipped. "The courthouse is just past that main avenue," he explained, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. "But with this traffic and the rain—" His voice faltered as another red light loomed ahead, forming a seemingly endless line of cars. Sophia let out an anguished sob as she saw the clock mark 10:45 p.m. The evidence they carried, Richard's video, the documents found at the orphanage, the testimonies they had obtained, it would all be useless if they didn't make it in time. The rain was now falling with renewed force, turning the streets into rivers and further reducing traffic speed. Michael pounded the steering wheel in frustration as another car cut him off, forcing him to brake sharply. Marina gripped the dashboard tightly, her pale face reflecting the fear they all felt. "We need a miracle," Marina whispered, her voice almost lost in the sound of the storm and the honking horns. The car's windshield was being battered by the rain, the wipers barely managing to maintain visibility. Lightning cracked across the sky, casting unsettling shadows over the flooded streets. Each headlight reflected like a threat on the turbulent night, each sharp break seeming to herald an imminent disaster. Michael looked in the rearview mirror, finding the anguished faces of the twins, so similar to Helen's. Their small bodies were tense, their hands intertwined as if holding each other not to get lost. Sophia's gaze was fixed on the road, as if trying to see beyond the rain, beyond the darkness, beyond the uncertainty. Claire bit her lip, her chest rising and falling too quickly, as if holding her breath along with the hopes they placed in Michael. Determination shone again in his eyes when he spotted a narrow passage between two trucks. It was risky, but they had no choice. Time was against them. Helen's fate hung by a thread, and the congested traffic seemed a relentless enemy. "Hold on," he ordered, firmly turning the wheel. The twins clung to their seatbelts, their little fingers digging into the fabric as if they could prevent the inevitable. Marina grabbed the edge of the dashboard, closing her eyes for a moment, a silent prayer forming on her lips. The engine roared as Michael stepped on the accelerator, the car sliding on the wet asphalt, the tires struggling against the water accumulated on the track. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, seeking a faster path through the heavy traffic. A truck partially blocked the lane, but he managed to find a safe gap. The sound of horns echoed around him, increasing the tension, but his only concern was reaching the courthouse on time. The car slid between the trucks and emerged on the other side, an almost empty avenue opening before them. Michael didn't hesitate. He accelerated even more, feeling adrenaline coursing through his veins like liquid fire. Sophia let out a trembling sigh, and Claire, still tense, asked in a choked voice, "Are we close?" Michael quickly glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Only 15 minutes left. 15 minutes to reach the courthouse. 15 minutes to prevent an irreversible mistake. "We're getting there," he assured, even though fear tried to contradict his words. Marina turned around and took the twins' hands, squeezing them affectionately. "It'll be okay," she murmured. "It has to be okay." Outside, the storm raged like a warning. But inside the car, 4 hearts beat in the same frantic rhythm of hope and urgency. Michael's car skidded into the courthouse entrance, its tires screeching against the wet asphalt as he braked sharply. The clock showed 11:15 p.m., and the rain continued to fall relentlessly over the city. The marble steps of the imposing building glistened under the streetlights, turning each step into a slippery trap. Sophia and Claire practically leaped from the back seat, even before the car came to a complete stop, their little legs running unconcerned by the storm drenching their orphanage uniforms. Michael and Marina followed closely behind, carrying the folders with the evidence protected inside their coats. A few meters from the entrance, 2 bulky security guards blocked their path, their stern expressions showing no emotion when they saw the drenched children approaching. "The courthouse is closed to visitors," one of them automatically declared, his deep voice rising above the sound of the rain. "Only authorized personnel can enter after business hours." The other guard took a step forward, his hands already moving to block the desperate group's passage. "Please," Michael tried to argue, showing his journalist badge dripping with rainwater. "We have crucial evidence about the Helen Carter case. The execution must be suspended." The guards exchanged bored looks, clearly accustomed to last-minute attempts to prevent sentences. "Express orders from Prosecutor Regina Scott," the first guard mechanically responded. "No one enters without her authorization." Inside the building, through the glass doors, they could see people hurrying through the corridors, preparing for what they considered just another routine execution. Sophia tried to run past under the guard's arms, but was easily restrained. Claire immediately ran to help her sister, their voices mingling in a chorus of desperate pleas. "Our mother is innocent," the twins screamed, their words echoing through the empty courthouse entrance. "Please let us in, we have evidence." Marina tried to intervene, explaining they were the condemned woman's daughters, but the guards remained unyielding. One of them even made a move to call for backup on the radio, fearing the situation might escalate. Through the glass doors, Michael spotted Judge Morrison crossing the main lobby, carrying a folder that likely contained the final documents needed to authorize the execution. Despair grew in his chest as he saw the magistrate enter the elevator, presumably on his way to the execution room. The minutes were quickly running out, and every second lost arguing with the guards was another second closer to Helen's death. Sophia and Claire also saw the judge, and their screams became even more anguished. "We have evidence our mother is innocent." The twins' voices cut through the night like a thunderbolt, charged with all the despair and love their little souls could muster. The echo of their screams reverberated off the marble walls of the courthouse, passing through the closed doors and catching the attention of everyone passing through the lobby. Staff members stopped to observe the commotion, some with expressions of pity, others clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding scene. The guards began pushing the group towards the sidewalk, determined to end the disturbance. "Please," Claire begged one last time, her tears mingling with the rain streaming down her face. "Regina Scott is lying. She and Richard were stealing food from the market." Sophia completed her sister's thought, as they always did. "Our mother found out the truth, so they locked her up." Their words reverberated through the night air, carrying the weight of a truth that desperately needed to be heard. Michael hugged the girls, trying to shield them from the rain while his mind worked frantically for a solution. The courthouse tower clock chimed, announcing that only a few minutes remained until midnight. The courthouse hallways were lit only by emergency lights, casting elongated shadows that danced on the marble walls. Michael, drenched to the bone, tried to argue with a middle-aged clerk organizing documents at the reception desk. The twins stood by his side, shivering in their wet uniforms, while Marina kept her eyes fixed on the wall clock that relentlessly marked the passing minutes. The clerk, whose badge identified him as Robert, shook his head as he consulted a list on his computer. "I'm sorry," Robert repeated for the third time, his tone revealing an internal conflict between compassion and duty. "Prosecutor Regina Scott has left strict orders. No one can interfere with the execution process under any circumstances. She threatened to fire any employee who disobeys." His hands trembled slightly as he organized the papers, avoiding direct eye contact with the children's faces. The sound of rain against the windows created a somber soundtrack for the moment, while the clock continued its merciless advance toward midnight. Sophia approached the counter, needing to stand on her tiptoes to be seen. "Please, sir," her small voice carried a maturity forced by pain. "Our mother is going to die for something she didn't do. It's Ms. Regina who was stealing from the market." Claire joined her sister, their identical eyes shining with unshed tears. "We have proof here," she said, pointing to the folder Michael was holding. "Please, you just need to give it to the judge." Robert looked around nervously, as if fearing the walls had ears, before leaning over the counter and whispering, "Regina has cameras everywhere. She's monitoring everything." It was at this moment that a police officer, who had been standing near the coffee machine discreetly observing the scene, approached the group. His uniform indicated he was one of those responsible for courthouse security, and his serious expression made Michael fear they would all be arrested for disturbance. However, when he spoke, his voice carried a note of determination no one expected. "My daughter is the same age as these girls," he said, looking directly at the twins. "I can't imagine what they're going through." His eyes turned to Michael, assessing the situation with years of experience. "What proof do you have?" Michael quickly opened the folder, showing Richard's video and the documents found by the girls. The officer, who introduced himself as Sergeant Turner, examined the material with professional attention, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the content. "This is pure dynamite," he muttered, carefully closing the folder. "The judge needs to see this immediately." Without hesitation, he took the folder from Michael's hands. "I know a back way to the execution chamber. Regina doesn't have cameras there." Robert, the clerk, made a motion to protest, but Sergeant Turner silenced him with a look. "Some things are more important than orders, Robert. You know that." With quick, precise movements, the officer tucked the folder inside his uniform. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice firm but gentle. "If this is true, you just saved a life." Before anyone could respond, he was already running down the hallway toward a service door, his footsteps echoing on the empty courthouse walls. Sophia and Claire embraced each other, their small hands intertwined in a silent prayer, while Michael and Marina watched the figure of the police officer disappear into the dimly lit corridor. Robert, the clerk, let out a trembling sigh before murmuring, "God help us if Regina finds out." Judge Morrison was in his chamber, the final execution documents scattered across his mahogany desk, when Sergeant Turner burst through the door, breathless and determined. The magistrate looked up, surprised by the interruption, as the officer placed a soaked folder on top of the papers he was about to sign. "Your Honor," Turner spoke, still catching his breath, "you need to see this before authorizing the execution." The clock on the wall read 11:40 p.m., each tick-tock echoing like a funeral drum in the silence of the room. With experienced fingers, the judge began examining the documents, his eyebrows gradually rising as he absorbed the explosive content of the evidence. The video, played on his laptop, clearly showed Richard ordering the repackaging of expired products, and Regina's voice could be heard in the background, giving specific instructions on how to proceed with the scheme. The records found by the girls completed the puzzle, revealing years of systematic fraud and misappropriation of donations. The magistrate's face visibly paled when he recognized his own signature on some of the documents Regina had tampered with. The door to the chamber was flung open violently, and Regina swept in like a human storm, her heels echoing like gunshots on the hardwood floor. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed at Sergeant Turner, before turning to the judge with a forced smile. "Your Honor, we cannot allow unverified evidence to delay justice. You yourself signed the execution order." Her voice faltered slightly as she noticed the video still playing on the laptop screen. "This is obviously a fabrication, a desperate attempt to—" "Silence!" the judge thundered, rising from his chair with an authority that made Regina take a step back. "These documents show a pattern of corruption extending for years, and this video—" He paused, observing Regina with eyes that were beginning to see through years of manipulation. "How do you explain your own voice ordering the repackaging of expired products?" Regina tried to argue, but the judge cut her off again. The condemned woman's daughters found part of this evidence. 2 7-year-old children managed what apparently no adult had the courage to do: expose the truth. "Those little brats should be in the orphanage," Regina snarled, completely losing her composure. Her eyes, once cold and calculating, now trembled with restrained fury, her hands clenched into fists on the table. How dare they interfere? Her voice, which had so often sounded firm and imposing in court, now carried an almost desperate tone, but her words died in her throat when the judge picked up the phone, his gaze laden with an unbreakable determination. He didn't blink, didn't hesitate. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed suffocating. His voice cut through the air like a sharp blade, each syllable laden with a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "Sergeant Turner, bring the girls here. I want to hear them personally before the court. And call the press too. The public needs to know the true face of our—" He paused for a moment, casting a cold glance at Regina before finishing with a cutting clarity. "Guardian of the law." The silence that followed was devastating. Regina remained motionless, but something in her expression changed. For the first time, her mask of absolute confidence seemed to shatter, like cracked glass about to break apart. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. There were no more arguments, no more blackmail that could save her now. Sergeant Turner nodded and quickly left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as he disappeared through the door. Regina, who just seconds ago had tried to impose her authority, was now paralyzed with fury and disbelief. Her eyes scanned the room, desperately seeking an exit, a loophole, anything that could reverse the situation. But there was nowhere left to run. Judge Morrison stood up, gathering the papers and evidence before him with the care of someone holding the final piece of a monumental puzzle. His fingers slid over the folders, over the documents that destroyed one by one the facade of integrity that Regina had built over the years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an almost prophetic weight. "In 20 years on the bench," he declared solemnly, his intonation strong and definitive, "I have never seen such corruption disguised as justice. I have never seen such a perversion of the system we swore to protect. This is not just another legal charade. It is a crime against the very essence of the law. And today, here before this court, we will hear the truth from those who have been silenced for too long." He then looked at those present in the room, journalists, court staff, lawyers, police officers. All were motionless, absorbing the gravity of the moment. None of them had ever seen a judge take such a stance, directly challenging one of the most powerful figures in the system. The very air seemed to vibrate with an invisible tension, a feverish expectation of what was to come. "Bring in the girls," he repeated, now without any hesitation. "I want to hear every word they have to say." And then, for the first time, Regina felt fear. The main courtroom was packed, despite the late hour. Journalists, staff, and curious onlookers crowded the wooden benches, creating a constant hum of whispers and speculation. Sophia and Claire, still in their damp orphanage uniforms, looked tiny before the imposing pulpit, where Judge Morrison presided over the extraordinary session. The twins clung to each other's hands tightly, seeking courage in the only support they had left since their mother had been arrested. "Silence in the courtroom!" The judge's voice thundered through the room, instantly quelling all murmurs. Regina was seated in the front row, her face a mask of contained fury, while Michael and Marina occupied strategic positions near the girls. The clock showed 11:45 p.m. when the judge addressed the twins with a gentleness that contrasted with his earlier authority. "Sophia and Claire Carter, you are here to tell the court how you found important evidence. Do not be afraid. Just tell the truth." Claire was the first to speak, her small voice surprisingly firm as it echoed through the microphones. "I was cleaning the hallway at the orphanage as punishment," she began, her hands trembling slightly. "Sister Constance always gave us difficult tasks because we were the daughters of—" Her voice faltered for a moment before continuing, "because they thought our mother was a thief. But I found an envelope under the trash can, with the drawing of the market where Mom worked." Sophia squeezed her sister's hand, giving her strength to go on. "There were papers inside, with numbers and dates. Even without being able to read properly, we recognized the numbers that Mum would write in her little notebook when she started suspecting something was wrong at the market." Sophia took over next, her voice carrying the same determination she had inherited from Helen. "Our mother always said we needed to be honest, even when we had little. She would get sad when she saw food being thrown away at the market, while people were going hungry." Her eyes met Regina's for a moment before continuing. "One day, she overheard Mr. Richard talking about changing the expiration dates on old products. She started taking notes on everything, but then—" Tears began streaming down her face, but her voice didn't waver. "Then they accused her of theft and arrested her." Judge Morrison made a gesture, and a large screen descended behind him. "We will now watch the video found in the files of the market's former security guard," he announced. The room fell into a deathly silence as the footage began to play. In the recording, Richard was clearly seen ordering the repackaging of expired products, while Regina's voice could be heard giving specific instructions on how to proceed with the scheme. In a corner of the warehouse, Helen was visible, her face registering the exact moment she discovered the truth about her employers. Those present in the courtroom watched the scene unfold on the screen, occasional gasps of indignation breaking the silence as Regina appeared in the video, coldly discussing how they would profit from selling unfit food. Sophia and Claire kept their eyes fixed on the image of their mother, that brief glimpse of the woman they hadn't seen in so long, causing their tears to flow freely. When the video ended, Judge Morrison turned to the prosecutor, who had lost all her arrogant poise. "Prosecutor Regina Scott," his voice cut through the air like a razor, "would you care to explain to the court how this video relates to your accusation against Helen Carter?" Richard abruptly stood up from his seat, his face flushed with nervousness as he tried to explain the inexplicable. "Your Honor, this video is clearly doctored," he stammered, adjusting his tie as if it were choking him. "I would never participate in such a scheme." His words were cut off by a firm voice from the back of the courtroom. A middle-aged man in a stockroom uniform stood up among the crowd. It was Charles, who had worked at the market for 15 years before being fired without justification 3 months ago. "You're lying, Richard," Charles declared, his voice echoing through the deathly silent room. "I was there. All the employees knew about the scheme, but no one dared say anything because Regina threatened our families." The man walked to the center of the courtroom, ignoring Regina's murderous glare. Helen found out when she stumbled upon the original inventory spreadsheets. Regina and Richard weren't just repackaging expired products, they were also embezzling donations meant for charities. When Helen started asking questions, they set her up. Her murmur of indignation rippled through the courtroom like a wave, growing in intensity, until Judge Morrison had to strike his gavel several times to restore order. Regina remained seated, rigid as a statue, as the magistrate turned to her with a piercing gaze. "Prosecutor Scott," his voice carried a weight of authority that instantly brought silence back to the room, How do you explain the fact that the market's security cameras apparently failed on the very night Helen Carter was arrested? Regina rose slowly, trying to maintain her usual composure, but her hands visibly trembled. Your Honor, these allegations are absurd. I have an unblemished reputation of years serving justice. The judge cut her off with a brusque gesture. Answer the question, prosecutor. Why are the only available footage from that night the ones you submitted as evidence? And why do those records show different timestamps from the system logs? Each word from the judge was like a nail in the coffin of the charade Regina had so carefully constructed. Charles took another step forward, taking an envelope from the pocket of his uniform. I have here copies of the original donation records, before being altered on Regina's orders. I kept them because I knew one day the truth would need to come out. The judge motioned for an officer to take the envelope, as Regina finally began to show signs of despair. Her empire of lies was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing more she could do to stop it. Judge Morrison hurried through the halls of the execution wing, his steps echoing off the cold walls, as Sergeant Turner and 2 officers followed close behind. The digital clock in the hallway blinked relentlessly. Only 3 minutes separated them from the fatal moment. The magistrate held in his hands the order to suspend the execution, the ink of his signature still fresh on the paper. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought of how many other decisions of his could have been manipulated by Regina over the years. The execution chamber was illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights that made the environment even more eerie. Helen was already positioned in the electric chair, her hands shaking slightly as a technician made the final preparations. Her eyes, red from crying, widened in surprise as the judge burst through the door, brandishing the document like a flag of salvation. "Stop everything!" His voice thundered through the room, making everyone freeze in their positions. "The execution is suspended by court order." The technician already had his finger on the fatal button, and for one terrifying moment he seemed to hesitate. "Now," Sergeant Turner ordered, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. The man instantly recoiled, and the officers rushed to release Helen, who seemed unable to comprehend the sudden change in her fate. "Your daughters," the judge gently explained, approaching her. "They found the evidence that exposed the entire conspiracy. Regina and Richard have been unmasked." Helen covered her face with her hands, sobs of relief shaking her body as the officers helped her up. It was at this moment that Regina appeared in the doorway, her face contorted into a mask of fury and despair. "Your Honor," her voice took on that honeyed tone that had fooled so many for so long, "we cannot allow the judicial system to be discredited in this way. Think of the impact this will have on all the cases we prosecuted together, on everything we built." She took a step forward, her eyes glinting with a feverish intensity. "There is still time to maintain order, to preserve the court's credibility. No one else needs to know the truth." Judge Morrison looked at Regina with a mixture of disgust and pity, realizing for the first time the true extent of her manipulation. For years he had witnessed her rise, her relentless dominance over the courts, her impeccable demeanor that inspired respect, or rather, fear. Now, however, he saw something different. A woman cornered, fighting to keep her mask intact as the cracks spread through the empire of lies she had built. But before he could respond, Regina pulled an envelope from her blazer, a cruel smile forming on her lips. Her fingers, always elegant and adorned with discreet rings, now trembled slightly as she held the paper, but her expression betrayed no weakness, only determination. It was her last trump card, and she knew it. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "I have here some very interesting information about certain past decisions of yours, Your Honor, decisions you would certainly not want made public." The judge paled. His hands, which rested firmly on the desk, now gripped the polished wood with force. He felt a cold sweat trickle down his neck, a familiar weight tightening his chest. Regina had always known where to strike, had always known which strings to pull to make even the most upright hesitate. For a brief moment, a heavy silence filled the room, as if time itself were suspended on the razor's edge of the veiled threat. But Regina was not done yet. Her gaze wandered meaningfully to Helen, still trembling in the officer's arms. The woman she had almost succeeded in destroying. The woman whose life she had tried to erase without a shred of remorse. Helen looked exhausted, her eyes still brimming with emotion and fatigue. But there was something new there, a glint of defiance, of contained fury, a fire Regina had not expected to find. "We're not finished here." Her voice sounded lower, but no less cutting. She slid the envelope across the desk toward the judge, her lips curling into a malicious smile. "It would be quite a scandal, wouldn't you agree, Your Honor? What would the press say if they discovered certain irregularities in your record? How many cases could be reopened? How many convicted criminals would be back on the streets due to a mistake of yours?" The Judge Morrison felt his stomach churn. Rage burned in his guts, but he kept his expression neutral, controlled. His gaze fixed on the envelope in front of him, as if that piece of paper carried the entire weight of his career, his reputation, his very conscience. But then he took a deep breath. The room was full of people who had been victims of Regina. Helen, Michael, Sophia, and Claire, they were all there, witnesses to the horror that woman had caused. And it was at that moment that Morrison realized it no longer mattered what Regina tried to do. Her empire had crumbled. The fear she had spread no longer held power there. With a slow, deliberate gesture, he took the envelope and, without even opening it, tore it in half. Regina gasped, her eyes widening in shock and fury. "You have no idea what you're doing," she hissed, her mask of control finally cracking. But Morrison merely stood up, his voice firm and unwavering when he replied, "On the contrary, Regina, for the first time, I know exactly what I'm doing." The courtroom was in absolute silence when Regina ascended to the pulpit, her face a studied mask of indignation that had served her so well during years of manipulation. Her high heels echoed on the marble floor like the tolling of a death knell, marking the final moments of her reign of terror. Judge Morrison watched her with stern eyes, while Helen, now free, held her daughters in her arms for the first time in months, the three of them silently crying tears of relief and rediscovered love. "Your Honor," Regina began, her voice trembling with an emotion that sounded false even to her own ears, "we are witnessing an elaborate conspiracy to destroy my reputation. Years of dedicated service to justice, hundreds of criminals jailed, and now I am the victim of a setup orchestrated by those envious of my success." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on Richard, who visibly shrank in his seat. Richard was in charge of managing the market. All operational decisions went through him. I was merely the owner, too busy with my duties as a prosecutor to supervise the day-to-day. Richard stood up abruptly, his face flushed with panic. "That's not true," he shouted, his voice shrill with desperation. "Regina controlled everything. Every detail of the scheme was planned by her." The man advanced to the center of the courtroom, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead as he pulled more papers from his briefcase. "I have emails, messages, direct orders from her about how to redate items, how much to charge for repackaged products, which employees to threaten into silence." Regina visibly paled as Richard continued his desperate confession. "She created the whole system," Richard went on, words pouring out like a finally breached dam. "The diverted donations. She had a network of buyers, the expired products. She knew exactly which smaller markets would repackage with no questions asked. When Helen started investigating, it was Regina who ordered us to plant false evidence in her locker." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of outrage, while Regina gripped the pulpit so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Liar!" she screamed, completely losing her composure. "You're trying to save your own skin. I am a servant of justice, Her words were cut off as Richard threw one last folder onto the judge's bench. "Here are the records of the offshore accounts where she kept the money from the illegal sales," he declared, his voice now steadier. "She forced me to sign as the account holder, but all the deposits were controlled by her. Regina is not a servant of justice, Your Honor. She is a criminal who used the system for her own gain, and I'm tired of being her accomplice." Judge Morrison rose slowly from his chair, the weight of years of manipulation and injustice weighing heavy on his shoulders as he surveyed the evidence laid out before him. The entire courtroom held its breath, the silence so thick one could hear the ticking of the large clock on the wall echoing like war drums. Regina remained standing, her former arrogance replaced by a visible tremble in her perfectly manicured hands, while Helen clutched her daughters tightly, as if fearing someone might try to separate them again. "This court," the judge began, his voice carrying a mixture of sorrow and resolution, has witnessed today one of the greatest perversions of justice in its entire history. The evidence presented leaves no doubt. Helen Carter was the victim of a criminal conspiracy, orchestrated by people who swore to uphold the law, but used it as an instrument of oppression and greed. His eyes fixed on Regina, who seemed to wilt under his stern gaze. The proof demonstrates not only her innocence, but also reveals a systematic scheme of corruption that nearly cost an innocent mother her life. The judge's gavel struck the bench with force, making everyone jump in their seats. Helen Carter is officially exonerated of all charges. Prosecutor Regina Scott, you are under arrest for fraud, evidence tampering, perjury, and attempted murder through the judicial system. 2 court officers approached Regina, who finally lost all composure. She tried to back away, but her legs were trembling so badly she could barely stand. The handcuffs clinked ominously in the courtroom's silence as they locked around her wrists, the same wrists that had signed Helen's arrest order months before. "Your empire of lies ends here," the judge declared, his voice carrying a definitive weight like a hammer sealing not just a verdict, but the end of an era of corruption. The courtroom sank into a heavy silence, charged with the gravity of that moment. Regina, who for years had carried herself as the untouchable queen of justice, was now vulnerable, reduced to a common criminal, just like those she had so despised. The judge paused, surveying the packed room. He looked at the faces of those present, lawyers, court staff, journalists, citizens who had long feared Regina. Expressions of shock and relief mingled among them. But what caught his eye the most was the look on the 2 small witnesses who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. "Every case you've acted on will be reviewed," he continued, his tone relentless. "Every sentence you've influenced will be re-examined." Regina opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to try one last gambit, but the metallic sound of the handcuffs clicking shut around her wrists silenced her immediately. The cold sensation of steel against her skin made her body shudder, and for the first time in years, real fear shone in her eyes. The officers held her by the arms and began to lead her out of the courtroom. Her heels echoed on the marble floor one last time, but now no longer with the usual confidence, but rather like the tremulous sound of someone marching towards their own inevitable fate. The clinking of the handcuffs mingled with the growing murmur of the crowd, who finally saw the one who had for so long considered herself invincible fall. "She's getting exactly what she deserves," someone muttered. "How many lives did this woman destroy?" another voice whispered, laden with indignation. The journalists who had been prevented from denouncing Regina for so long now raised their cameras, recording every detail of her walk of disgrace. Sophia and Claire watched the scene embraced by their mother, their little bodies huddled against Helen as if, for the first time, they could truly breathe without fear. Their faces were marked no longer by tears of sadness, but of relief, a relief so deep that it almost made them collapse right there. Helen held her daughters tightly, her heart racing, trying to process the enormity of the moment. Everything they had gone through, all the pain, all the despair, all the fear, now it seemed to dissipate like a shadow before the light of justice. She closed her eyes for a second, feeling her daughter's little hands squeezing hers, as if they needed to be sure she was really there. The nightmare was finally over. The courtroom, which had once been a scene of injustice and pain, now witnessed the victory of truth over lies, of courage over fear. And in that moment, Helen knew that for the first time in a long time, she could look to the future without terror, only with hope. The metallic sound of keys echoed through the prison corridors as the guard opened Helen's cell, who was still wearing the orange uniform she had just minutes ago believed would be her shroud. Her hands trembled as she gathered the few belongings she had accumulated during her stay. Some letters she had written to her daughters, a small rosary of worn beads from being clutched in moments of despair, and faded photographs of happier times. The reality of her release seemed like a dream she was afraid to wake up from, each step out of the cell laden with a hesitation, born of fear that it was nothing more than another cruel illusion. The guard led her through the familiar corridors, now seen in a completely different light. The same grey walls that had represented her confinement for months now seemed less oppressive, as if they too celebrated her proven innocence. Other inmates watched her pass, some waving a silent farewell, others whispering words of joy at seeing that sometimes justice truly prevailed. Helen could barely process the events of the last few hours. The imminent execution, the judge's arrival, The revelation of the truth, it all seemed jumbled in her mind like a feverish dream she feared waking up from. In the processing room, Helen exchanged the prison uniform for the same clothes she wore the day of her arrest, now loose on her body, thinned by months of confinement. The fabric, once fitted to her form, now hung loose, betraying the days of meager meals and sleepless nights. She ran her trembling fingers over the fabric of the blouse, feeling the roughness she hadn't noticed before. It was a common outfit, but it carried the memory of the day everything collapsed. A shiver ran down her spine as she remembered the last time she wore those pieces, the night she was torn from her daughters without even being able to hug them. The metal desk in front of her creaked slightly as the officer on duty placed the last pile of documents. The heavy stamp came down with force, marking her release with a dull sound that seemed to echo throughout the room. Each paper she signed seemed unreal, her hands shaking so much she could barely form her signature. The letters came out trembling, irregular, as if her very identity was still unstable, trying to reconstitute itself after months of being treated as a number, as a lost case. "I need you to sign here." "And here too," said the officer, his voice sounding distant, muffled by the fog of emotions engulfing Helen. She nodded mechanically, her fingers gripping the pen tightly, as if she needed something physical to keep her anchored in that moment. Her eyes stung. She didn't know if it was from exhaustion or from the anticipation of seeing Sophia and Claire again. Her heart seemed small within her chest, as if it had shrunk with suffering, and was now desperately trying to expand again. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of stamps and forms, the last door began to open. The creaking of the hinges sounded like thunder in her ears. The morning sunlight streamed in through the cracks, momentarily blinding her unaccustomed eyes to so much brightness. She blinked several times, trying to adjust, and then took her first step outside. The fresh air hit her face like an electric shock. It was different from the heavy air of the cell, laden with moisture and despair. This one was alive, full of aromas and sounds she feared she would never feel again. And then, when the door finally opened completely, her heart stopped. There they were, her little ones, her treasures, Sophia and Claire, holding hands, waiting for their mother with smiles that shone brighter than the sun itself. The girls' hair swayed slightly in the morning breeze, and their eyes, identical to hers, were filled with hope and love. Helen felt her legs weaken. It was real. They were there. Their restless little feet betrayed their urge to run to her, but something, perhaps the fear that it was all a dream, kept them still for a brief second. But then, as if an invisible thread was cut, Sophia let go of her sister's hand and took off, with Claire right behind her. "Mommy!" The scream tore through the air like an unerring arrow, hitting Helen's chest with such force that she nearly fell to her knees. Time seemed to slow down as the little bodies collided with her, the skinny arms wrapping around her torso like roots, finally coming back home. Helen fell to her knees, clutching the girls as if she wanted to fuse them to her own body. Her face buried in their soft hair, desperately inhaling their scent, their warmth, their existence. "My girls, my girls." Her voice was a choked whisper, but Sophia and Claire heard every word, for they were exactly where they had always belonged, in their mother's arms. The morning sun bathed the prison courtyard with a golden light that seemed to bless the moment of reunion. Helen barely had time to take 2 steps out of the building before Sophia and Claire launched themselves in her direction, their small bodies flying like birds finally freed from a cage. The impact nearly knocked Helen down, who fell to her knees on the rough concrete, but she barely felt the pain. All that mattered were her daughter's arms around her, the warmth of their bodies, the scent of their hair, all the sensations she had feared never experiencing again. Tears flowed freely down the three's faces, blending into a single expression of joy and relief, so profound that words seemed inadequate to describe them. Helen covered her girls' faces with kisses, her hands trembling as she touched their cheeks, as if she needed to make sure they were real, that it wasn't just another of the dreams that tormented her in her lonely cell. Sophia and Claire clung to their mother with all the strength their little arms allowed, as if fearing she might disappear if they let go for even a second. "My little warriors," Helen whispered between sobs, pulling away just enough to look deep into her daughter's eyes. "How you've grown, how brave you've been." Her words were punctuated by emotion, each syllable laden with the weight of all the "I love yous" she couldn't say during the months of separation. Claire buried her face in her mother's neck, her little body shaking with sobs, while Sophia gently traced her fingers over Helen's face, as if wanting to memorize every detail again. Michael watched the scene from a few meters away, feeling his own tears rolling silently down his cheeks. In his years of investigative journalism, he had witnessed countless injustices, but few victories as sweet as this one. The sound of Helen's laughter mingling with the girl's joyful cries was the purest music, the living proof that sometimes, just sometimes, good truly triumphed over evil. His hands gripped the camera, recording the moment, not for a story, but so that family would never forget the day when love and truth overcame cruelty and lies. "You saved Mommy," Helen kept murmuring, kissing her daughters' foreheads between words. "My little heroines." Sophia and Claire finally smiled through their tears, that identical smile like a ray of sunshine after the storm. Michael felt his heart swell with a joy he had not experienced in a long time. There in that prison yard that had witnessed so many sad goodbyes, a family reunited once again, proving that justice, though sometimes slow, was still possible when brave people, even little ones, refused to give up on the truth. Regina was unrecognizable in the defendant's bench, her orange prison uniform contrasting dramatically with the designer clothes she used to wear. Her hair, once impeccably styled, hung lifelessly over her pale, haggard face. The courtroom, which had so often been the stage for her theatrical performances as a prosecutor, now witnessed her downfall. The very walls that had echoed her accusations against innocents like Helen now fell silent as she faced the consequences of her own crimes. Richard occupied the witness stand, his hunched posture evidencing the weight of the guilt he carried. For hours, he meticulously detailed every aspect of the criminal scheme they had operated together. His voice trembled as he described how they manipulated expiration dates, how they embezzled donations meant for charities, and how they fabricated false evidence against employees who threatened to expose the truth. In exchange for his full cooperation, the prosecutor had offered a significant reduction in his sentence, turning his potential 20 years in prison into just 8. Regina kept detailed records of everything, Richard explained, avoiding looking at his former boss. She had a second set of accounting books hidden in a safe at her beach house. All the evidence is there. Names of corrupt judges, bribed politicians, embezzled funds over the years. With each new revelation, Regina sank deeper into her chair, her empire of lies crumbling like a house of cards. The presiding judge, no longer Morrison, who had recused himself due to his prior involvement, listened intently to every word, his notes filling page after page. The prosecution presented an impressive list of charges: fraud, extortion, falsifying evidence, perjury, attempted homicide through the judicial system. Each crime read aloud echoed like a blow against Regina, who had once ruled that courtroom with her relentless presence. Now the woman who for so long dictated fates, with a mere raise of her eyebrow, shrank before the irrefutable evidence of her own actions. The murmurs in the room intensified. The audience, journalists, court staff, and victims of her schemes, watched in a mix of outrage and satisfaction. The woman who had once made judges hesitate could no longer meet the judgmental stares surrounding her. Her empire of manipulation crumbled before her very eyes, each puzzle piece she had constructed over the years being dismantled, turning into evidence against herself. Her lawyers, no longer the elite she used to retain, were now visibly uncomfortable public defenders. They flipped through papers, exchanged uncertain glances, and hesitated before speaking. None of them were prepared to face a charge of this magnitude. There were no loopholes, no technical errors to exploit. The volume of evidence was so overwhelming that every attempt at argument sounded flimsy, laughable even. Your Honor," one of the lawyers cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he tried to recompose himself. Our client vehemently denies such accusations and—" Judge Morrison raised his hand, cutting her off immediately. His cold gaze pierced the trembling defense. "Refute it?" he repeated, the disbelief evident in his voice. He picked up a folder on his desk, opened it, and removed a series of documents. "Here are orders signed by the accused coercing witnesses. Here are records of illicit transfers linked to her name. Here are testimonies from victims who were falsely convicted under her influence." The judge took a deep breath before continuing. If the defense wants to argue that this evidence is insufficient, I suggest they re-evaluate their strategy. He slapped the folder against the desk with a dull thud, signaling that this discussion would not be prolonged. Regina swallowed hard. Her nails dug into the wood of the desk in front of her, her trembling hands betraying the facade of coldness she tried to maintain. For the first time in her life, there was no easy way out. Your empire, built through manipulation and fear, now served as a witness against herself. Every forged document, every threat made, every life destroyed, came back to haunt her at her moment of judgment. The courtroom, once her absolute domain, was now the arena where she would face her ruin. The cameras captured everything, the flashes exploded with each new evidence presented. The audience followed every detail, waiting for the sentence that would seal the fate of the woman who, for years, believed herself to be above the law. And in that instant, Regina realized what she had never considered possible. She was already condemned. Helen's new home shone under the afternoon sun, its freshly painted yellow walls reflecting the joy that now filled the family's life. The small front garden, though still modest, already showed signs of the loving care it received. Colorful flowers sprouted in improvised flower beds, and a tire swing hung from the old tree, gently swaying in the breeze. Michael watched with satisfaction as Sophia and Claire ran across the lawn, their laughter echoing through the air like music. The compensation Helen had received from the state, coupled with the help Michael had obtained through a campaign with other journalists, had made this fresh start possible, far from the shadows of the past. Helen was on the porch, preparing lemonade on the wooden table that now served as the family's outdoor dining center. Her eyes shone with a peace that seemed to illuminate everything around her, as if each moment of happiness were a precious treasure to be savored. The twins had returned to school, making friends who visited them without the stigma they had once carried at the orphanage. Life, which had seemed frozen in an endless nightmare for so long, now flowed with the naturalness of things that are exactly as they should be. Michael was preparing to leave after another of his regular visits. He had become a constant presence in the family's life, a silent guardian of their regained happiness. He watched with tenderness as Helen served the lemonade in colorful glasses, each gesture laden with a gratitude that words could not express. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the trees in the backyard, casting delicate shadows over the rustic wooden table. The wind gently swayed the curtains on the porch, bringing with it the citrusy aroma of the freshly prepared drink, mixed with the light scent of the flowers planted by the twins. Sophia, realizing he was about to leave, ran up to him and took his hand with the innocence of her age. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, met his with a wisdom beyond her years. "You saved our mom," she said simply, her voice filled with a pure, childlike gratitude. Her small hands gripped his tightly as if to make sure he wouldn't disappear like so many others had in her short life. Claire soon followed, holding onto the hem of her sister's shirt, as if to reinforce what had been said. Michael knelt down to their level, a gentle smile lighting up his face as he replied, "You're the ones who never gave up on her." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that went beyond words. He ran his hand through Sophia's dark hair, feeling the lump in his throat grow. "You're both much braver than you realize," he added, his eyes turning to Claire, who was now fiddling with the hem of her shirt, seeming to think about the words she wanted to say. Claire lifted her face, her eyes shining with a mixture of curiosity and emotion. "Will you come back?" she asked, a slight tremble in her voice, as if fearing the answer. For so long they had learned that people always left. First their father, then the few adults who had tried unsuccessfully to help them, and finally their mother herself, torn away from them without just explanation. Michael took a deep breath and looked at Helen, who was now watching them from the porch, a discreet smile on her lips. "Always," he replied with conviction. "You're part of my family now." He knew that as much as he had come here seeking justice, he had found something he never imagined, a purpose. Helen approached, wiping her hands on her apron before gently placing them on her daughter's shoulders. "He will always be welcome," she said tenderly, her eyes meeting Michael's. There was something unspoken in that look, a silent understanding they both shared. They had been through so much together, and now, finally, they could breathe. The wind blew again and Sophia smiled, holding the journalist's hand as if to keep him there for just a little longer. "So, before you go, can you have another glass of lemonade?" she asked, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Michael laughed, nodding in agreement. How could I refuse? And there, under the warm glow of the late afternoon, amidst childish laughter and the clinking of glasses, a new story began. If Sophia and Claire's story touched you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story appearing on the screen now, specially chosen for you. See you soon.